My name is Jeff Matsu. I am a co-investigator with CASH and a co-lead on the housing and the economy theme. I'm also a senior economist at the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors. Housing is high on the political agenda. Over the past 15 years, we've seen 3 fairly comprehensive reports looking at housing supply, mortgage markets, and how the overall tax system can be reformed. And it's on this latter review that we draw heavily on, the Cyrille's review, because taxation helps support housing consumption. And the distortions that taxation introduces through that mechanism is something that we try to learn more about in the evidence review itself as to whether, relative to other markets, the housing sector has greater or less distortions, and what ultimately that means from a policymaker's perspective. The first 2 areas that we focused on were non-recurrent taxes. So for this review, we looked at transfer taxes such as stamp duty and capital gains taxes. Both of these increase the overall cost of transactions, thereby reducing the number of transactions that actually take place. And so we looked to the academic literature to see how this mechanism takes place within the UK and whether or not other countries are able to do it slightly differently with better outcomes elsewhere. The main consideration here was that the reduction in flows of transactions can have negative impacts elsewhere in the economy. For example, looking at relative reductions in labor force mobility as a possible negative side effect of these types of taxes. Another aspect of these 2 non-recurrent taxes is how they influence behavior towards home ownership. In particular, in the UK, there is no tax assessment on imputed rents, and until very recently, mortgage interest payments were fully deductible. And so from a policy perspective, it's important for us to assess whether or not we are trying to target home ownership over renting, and if so, if there's a desired level that we considered ideal in terms of home ownership rates. The third area of taxation that we assessed was that of the private rented sector, and in particular the qualitative aspects on how quality can be improved. What our review of the evidence shows is that there unfortunately isn't that much empirical analysis to date that has been done in this area. And that may be due to 2 reasons. One is the relative recent increase of the PRS sector here in the UK. And the other is the lack of a standard definition of what we mean by quality of rented accommodation. And so until we can address these 2 areas, the evidence review has shown that more research and data collation is needed if we are to try to balance how people decide to live, whether it's in rented accommodation or via home ownership itself. In addition to improving the quality of the private rented sector, another area that of potential research would be looking at how we can improve affordability for certain groups within society. And that is something that the international experience also shows there is fairly thin empirical evidence at the moment. In terms of how we can learn from the experience within the UK, stamp duty would be an excellent example because that has, over the past couple of years, been devolved to Scotland and Wales. So once we have sufficient data collected, we can ascertain how changes to transaction tax affects behavior of both buyers and sellers, which is very important from assessing the effects of taxation policy itself. A final conclusion from this evidence review is that as well as the tax policies themselves, what's important is the transition process of moving from one tax system to another. So for this particular review, we looked at perhaps moving from a system based on stamp duty to one of more recurrent taxation.